I told you a long time ago, this is just kind of a geeky science story that I want to share with you, but I found it so fascinating. When we were living in Vermont and I was writing Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, this was back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, 96, 97, something like that. And I learned that there had been some sort of an analysis done by somebody at the University of Vermont of the Abenaki stories. The Abenakis are the Native Americans of Vermont. Of Abenaki stories about when the Great Walls of Ice vanished. In other words, when the Ice Age ended 11,000 years ago. And they went out and looked at gravel quarries and whatnot, so you could see where, okay, this glacier melted here, and that one melted there, and this one ended here, and all this kind of stuff. And what they found was basically that the Abenaki memory was accurate. A 10,000, 11,000-year-old memory was accurate. Now, and I wrote about, you read all about this in Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. Leonard Schlein, who is now deceased, but who I knew, he was a neurosurgeon, a very, very smart guy, smarter than Ben Carson. And what can I say? He wrote a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And the premise of The Alphabet versus the Goddess was that when we learn an abstract alphabet, that is to say, an alphabet that is not pictographic, a pictographic alphabet would be where a little drawing of a bird means bird. A little drawing of a cat means cat, right? An abstract alphabet is where B-I-R-D means bird and C-A-T means cat. And they don't look anything like a bird or a cat, right? They're just letters. It's abstract. That when, before the age of 7, we learn an abstract alphabet, it remolds our brain in ways that cause the left hemisphere, the right side of the body, the left hemisphere of the brain, to basically take over. And the left hemisphere is the most recent hemisphere. It's the newest part of us. And it's basically where logic and thought are processed. I mean, these are wild generalizations, but there's a large germ of truth to them. And whereas the right hemisphere is where, well, for example, you've got Broca's region in the left temporal lobe, which again controls the right side of the body. When you're talking about the brain, you kind of have to reverse it in your head. But Broca's region in the left temporal lobe, that is over by the ears, is where we process language. It's how you are understanding the words I am saying right now. Wernicke's region, the exact same part of the brain, but on the right side instead of the left side, is where we process music. So if I was singing or when you hear music, your memories of music, they're coming out of the right side of your brain. You're understanding the words or understanding the logic comes out of the left side of the brain. It's one reason why singing is so holistic and so therapeutic, because it's activating both sides of the brain. And it's also one of the reasons why they think that maybe we started singing long before we started talking. But I digress slightly. So the theory about why the Abenakis remembered things was that non-literate cultures, in other words, oral tradition cultures, which the Abenaki had been for 10,000 years, those cultures passed stories down from mother to daughter, from father to son, from parent to child, generation after, and within communities, generation after generation after generation. And those stories tend to remain pure and intact because they are the way that we transmit culture. We transmit culture by telling stories. For example, the little boy who cried wolf. What does that story tell us? And that story hasn't changed in 1,000 years. What does that story tell us? Don't cry wolf, basically. There are dangers to alarming your community. It's not a fun thing to do. It's a dangerous thing to do. I mean, in other words, it's a morality story, but it's told as a story. Well, now they've just done a study on the Aborigines of Australia. And this is in Science Daily, September 17th, by Taylor and Francis, a study. And the headline is, Aboriginal Memories of Australia's Coastline Go Back More Than 7,000 Years. And that's Aboriginal Society has preserved memories of Australia's coastline dating back more than 7,000 years. That's the conclusion of the University of Sunshine Coast professor of geography, Patrick Nunn, reached in a groundbreaking paper published today in the academic journal Australian Geographer. They described the pair's study of Aboriginal stories from 21 places around Australia's coastline, each describing a time when sea lines were significantly lower than today. And then Professor Nunn said, present sea levels in Australia were reached 7,000 years ago, and as such, any stories about the coastline stretching much farther out to sea had to predate that time. These stories talk about a time when the sea started to come in and cover the land, and the changes this brought about to the way people lived, the changes in the landscape, the ecosystem, the disruption it caused their society. In other words, this is a 7,000-year-old accurate memory. So what happens when people start writing down their memories? We stop passing them from parent to child. Your grandfather did not sit you down at his knee and say, let me tell you about Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. Let me tell you the stories about what America used to be like. No, we don't do. We write it down. And when you write things down, you forget them. And the society as a whole forgets them. And a small number of people, the historians, are the ones who hold the past. And then you get people like David Talbot, the right-wing pseudo-historian, who makes up quotes from the founders to prove that they were all, Bible-thumping Christians. And you get this thing of, he who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. In fact, Sue gave me the exact quote in the chat room the other day. I'm sorry, I don't remember it, but it was I know who said it, but that's the point. So anyhow, I don't have a therefore out of this other than that I think that in Sweden they don't start teaching language alphabet until the age of 7. Their kids graduate high school at 16, and they beat our kids. This is something that Rudolf Steiner argued for strongly, is let kids be kids until they're 7 years old. Maybe there's something there. In fact, I think almost certainly there's something there. And Len Schlein argued in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, that it was when we became literate back about 1,000 years ago, back after Gutenberg and whatnot, that we started killing women. You're in a big way.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
Prior to that, most of the churches in Europe were dedicated to Mary. After that, the churches were dedicated to Jesus, and the women healers were called witches, and they were executed.